Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of Jig Retro, where we're going to be taking a look at my personal favourite top 10 NES games. This is a really interesting one because the NES presence in the UK was basically non-existent with the huge success of the ZX Spectrum and the Commodore 64. The software for these games was so cheap and piracy was everywhere. My dad used to copy the games on a tape-to-tape player. This led to computers maintaining their dominance over the NES and Master System's very impressive life cycles. It was the Mega Drive in the UK that I would solely suggest was what turned heads away from microcomputers. I only knew one friend who had an NES back in the day, and I'm pretty sure he only had the Super Mario Brothers and Duck Hunt combo cartridge with the gun. Despite its failure here, I couldn't help but be impressed with some of the elements of those games. The load times were so fast, especially compared to microcomputers where it would take about half an hour to load a game into it. And the light gun with Duck Hunt, that just seemed magical to me. With that said, I've got absolutely no nostalgia for this system. If you enjoy this episode, then please take a moment out of your time to like, share and subscribe, as well as check out my back catalogue. All of my love for this system has come from retrospectively playing video games, collecting video games and researching, as well as checking out awesome classic YouTube content such as the Angry Video Game Nerd and the Metal Jesus Crew's John Riggs. Mostly content creators from across the pond. The release of the absolutely fantastic Nintendo Entertainment System Mini led me to crave more from its amazing library. What a great little system, this is an instant recommendation from me. Anyway, that's enough background, here goes my top 10 NES games. Shadow Warriors, or Ninja Gaiden as it is known elsewhere, developed by Tecmo and released in 1988, but not until 1991 here in Europe. Interestingly, this was developed for the NES at the same time as its more brawler-style arcade counterpart. This game is so well done and has spawned absolutely countless influences. This is one of the first ninja games that I played that really gives you the feeling of speed and reflexes of actually being a ninja. The cinematics between levels really set this game apart and make it really ahead of its time. The only thing that potentially lets it down for me is how unfairly hard it can be at times, with respawning enemies, sprites and bottomless pits aplenty. Shatter Hand, developed by Natsumi and released in late 1991 in Japan and North America and Europe in 1992. I don't believe that this game would be in many people's top 10 lists, but it has influenced a recent indie game that I absolutely love in Cyber Shadow. In this game you punch your way through multiple levels while collecting power-ups which assist you in different ways. You find crates which have letters alpha and beta in which you can swap the letters by punching it. Once 3 are collected in any order, you can gain one of 8 possible satellite robots, all with different abilities, including shooting lasers, fireballs, bouncy balls, yo-yo and sword style weapons. Mega Man 3, developed by Capcom and released in 1990 in Japan and 1992 in North America and Europe. I think most would say that Mega Man 2 is the best, and you have no real argument from me, but I go with Mega Man 3. Frankly, it's just this one that I have a physical cart of, and I just find myself playing it more than any other. This game has a steep learning curve, but I just like to Google the easy order and work my way through it from there. I think in Mega Man it all relates to your favourite bosses and skills from them, and added game mechanics. They are all great games. This one in particular features a new sliding mechanic which can be used to avoid enemies and get under low areas. There is also a new canine companion with his own set of new abilities and a few extra levels between the 8 bosses and Dr. Wily's fortress. Punch-Out! This is a fantastic game. Originally titled Mike Tyson's Punch-Out!, actually released in Europe the same year as everywhere else in 1987, probably due to it being a Nintendo game. It is a wonderfully presented boss rush where pattern recognition is essential. This works so well in the world of boxing. This could possibly be the best boxing game ever, even to this day, yet to be bettered. This is a port of an arcade title, but everything is improved here, apart from potentially the graphics. With that said, it uses the graphics it can produce in a much cleverer way, with the little Mac sprite being so small as to not disrupt the view of the enemy. And it really makes each match feel like a David versus Goliath encounter. Metroid, developed by Nintendo, was released in Europe in 1988. This one is really pushing the boundaries of the NES and gaming as a whole conceptually. Simple atmosphere in droves, and the soundtrack fits so well. The influence of the movie Alien is all over this game. This is defo a game where you need to get your pad and pen out, but I kind of think that it's all part of the fun. Don't get me wrong, with similar looking graphics it is way too easy to get lost, and I much prefer later iterations of Metroid with maps and a slightly more gated exploration. But this is Metroidvania in its purest and simplest form. With that said, whenever I play it, I tend to play it with a guide and a map in hand. The start of an iconic franchise for me. I can't help but recommend playing the remake of Metroid Zero Mission, which was released for the Game Boy Advance, over this version. But the great thing is that the original is also an unlockable for beating the game for a good old bit of nostalgia. That remake is also one of the best games on the Game Boy Advance. DuckTales was developed by Capcom with key members from the Mega Man series. This was released in Europe in 1990, exactly a year behind the American release, which is where it was released first. This game is somewhat more forgiving and accessible than Mega Man. I played Quackshot for the Mega Drive first, which in a lot of ways shares the adventure choose the level elements with this game. I can really appreciate that this game is the original. I personally played the Game Boy version more back in the day, but now that I am able to play this slightly more fleshed out version, then I haven't really looked back at the Game Boy port. The cane jumping mechanic is iconic and influenced the indie smash hit Shovel Knight. Castlevania 3 Draculas Curse, developed by Konami and released in Europe in 1992, which was a whole 2 years after the North American release. As you well know, I absolutely adore the Castlevania series and appreciate every single one. Those who know me will know that I'm a sucker for an original title rather than a sequel, but this one just adds so much more content and replayability value over the fantastic original. And as much as I love running through Simon's Quest with a guide, it is extremely flawed, especially in the translation. Castlevania 3 just edges it as my favourite on this system, but honestly I have time for all three in my life. Added characters, branching paths, loads more levels, and sticking to the original's action platforming roots. I would definitely say that this is the hardest of the NES games, but entering your name as Help Me will let you start the game with 10 lives, which makes things a little less brutal and accessible. Super Mario Bros. Duck Hunt Combo Cartridge. Developed by Nintendo and released in 1987. I know, Super Mario 3 really has loads more going for it than the original title, but I just can't help but love the simple perfection and nostalgia that I feel with the original Super Mario Bros. This game, alongside the release of the NES, was undeniably one of the factors in reviving the video game industry from its 1983 crash, and it hasn't really looked back since. Platforming perfection that absolutely anyone can enjoy. Almost anyone could recognise the soundtrack, and the version that has the dual cart with Duck Hunt, I mean, stop it. Duck Hunt is nowadays an experience reserved for super geeky game collectors who have their own big box CRT telly, but it is still as fun and magical as it was the first time you set eyes upon it. Dr. Mario, developed by Nintendo and released in 1991 in Europe. This is a wonderful puzzler which admittedly isn't quite as good as the mighty Tetris, but frankly, mainly due to nostalgia, I prefer that puzzler on the original Game Boy. This one I prefer on the NES. Having the actual colours makes things much simpler than the varieties of darkening bogey green on the Game Boy version. I think that this version lends itself better to competing with a friend, which I feel is where the game really shines. A really well done, simple colour matching puzzle game. A great game to introduce a friend or partner to the world of video gaming. My mum absolutely loved the Game Boy version. As soon as you have picked up the controller, this one will have you hooked. My number one is Batman, released in 1990 in Europe and developed by Sunsoft. This is my favourite action platforming game for the system. I would say that it is tough but manageable and is actually really well balanced. I feel that it is much more accessible than its reputation suggests. Each level takes its time to really get you into perfecting that wall jump mechanic that you will absolutely have to nail in order to beat the final stage, and learning which weapon out of fists, batarangs and rockets is best to use in each situation and boss encounter. It's all really engaging, albeit packaged in an extremely loose movie tie-in to my most nostalgic of Batman movies. The soundtrack is wonderful 8-bit perfection. This game was covered in my Batman 1989 retrospective, in which I covered some of the releases, so please check out that video if you have time. I hope you've enjoyed this video, but I'm sure you are all wondering where Contra, or Probotector as it is known as Europe, is in this list. Well, for me, I do have huge respect for the series as a whole, and I do enjoy it in short bursts, but to be honest, it is way too brutal for my tastes. At some point soon, I promise I will give it a damn good go, but almost certainly with the Konami code to make it a little bit easier for me. Maybe after that it will sneak up into my top 10 of NES games. If my research from this video has taught me one thing, it is that we receive games for the NES so late compared to other regions that I'm not actually now surprised that it bypassed me back in the day. I think by the time that most of these great games were released, I was already fully invested in the Sega Mega Drive. Please comment down below with any recommendations that you think should be in my NES top 10 list, and I will endeavour to get to them. Until next time, much love, please look after yourselves and each other and get your geek on with Jig Retro.